Today we're going to review the Sony a6300. If you're on the fence about this camera or considering picking one up, this is the video for you. There's been a lot of buzz on this camera, both good and bad. So today I'm going to share with you my experience after shooting quite a bit with it, playing with it. I've even done a guide which you can check out where we cover anything and everything you need to know about taking this stills camera, setting it up for video. So I'm going to do a traditional pros and cons and talk about some little things that I've noticed and talk about whether or not this camera is worth it given the problems that it has. So let's start with the pros. The size of the camera I actually like. I didn't think I would. I actually have become somewhat fond of the way Sony has been doing these smaller cameras because they're easy to rig up. When you start with a larger camera that isn't quite perfect, it gets pretty bulky by the time you build it up. These little guys, including the Sony a7S, a7R, and those cameras, you can pretty easily set something up like this and modify it and get something that isn't massive and is quite usable. So the size doesn't really bother me, but it adds to some issues which we'll talk about a little bit later. Obviously, big feature on this camera is 4K. Works really well, and what's interesting is you're actually getting 6K downscaled to 4K. So similar to the C100 where you start with a 4K sensor and downscale to 1080, that's going to give you a lot of detail, and it's also going to give you a little more latitude, and it helps with things like noise in the image because you start with such a high resolution. When you squeeze that down to 4K and then again in post to 1080, which a lot of us do, noise, grain, things like that are going to be lost, which is a good thing. So 4K works really well, not too much to say about that. Low light on this camera is also incredible. This is pretty much the best Super 35 APS-C sensor when it comes to low light. So destroys Canon and other cameras, so it's really, really amazing. Another huge pro to this camera is autofocus. This is the first camera that I've come to accept and enjoy using autofocus. It's just amazing. I'm blown away, and I really don't like Sony lenses in and of themselves. They suck at manual focus for the most part, but with these cameras, the autofocus is so good that I'm finding I'm just using autofocus all the time. So in general, I've been shooting manual focus for interviews. Unless I want a really shallow depth of field, then I'll turn on face recognition on the camera. But for B-roll, you have just so many great options. So in my a6300 guide, we break down everything when it comes to autofocus. I've spent a lot of time using autofocus on the camera, and I can say it's pretty dang solid. The only things you need to look out for is shooting in low light. Autofocus needs light to see what's going on. It needs contrast. So it's not going to work out on the street in the dark. I've really, really liked it. And for B-roll, even getting some camera movement, which we talk about some tricks in the guide, there's some really cool things you can do. While we're talking about autofocus, lens options is a massive pro on this camera. Not only do we have all these Sony lenses, which for the most part are some of the cheapest stabilized lenses. So in the guide we show 7 different Sony lenses. Every single one of them has image stabilization, and you can pick up a great lens with stabilization for around $300, which is ridiculous. So that's huge, but the Sony lenses are good, and for autofocus they're really great. But there's so many other options, and the Sony E-mount is one of the best mounts to adapt to. There's a lot of great adapters out there with some amazing features, and because of the flange distance, there's just endless options. So if you like tinkering with third-party adapted lenses or just want to use some Sony lenses, you cannot go wrong with this camera. Another amazing thing with this camera is frame rate options. We can go up to 120 frames per second in 1080. Now the quality isn't as good, or the bit rate is a lot lower, but it's an option and it's great. Canon just released one of the first DSLRs that has 60 frames per second at 1080. So we've got double that on this camera, and it's $1,000. So that's pretty incredible. So those are the things that I liked about the camera. Now let's talk about some gnarly stuff. First, obviously, the big one that everyone talks about, overheating. And it's no surprise to me that this camera overheats when you look at it. It's so small, and when you consider what's going on here, we've got a large sensor downscaling 6K to 4K, writing it to a card, and the thing is tiny. When you look at the side with the screen pulled away, It's not that big. So in the guide, we talk about several solutions. One that I recently discovered thanks to Erik Naso, I'll put a link to the post in the description. He found that using wicked fast cards helped with overheating. And I think the difference for him was 15, 16 minutes on a cheaper card. And then he got a long, over an hour of shooting with a more expensive fast card. So that might be something to look into if you're having overheating problems. Personally, I've been using the card that only gives him 16 minutes of record time. And I've shot a couple different gigs, over an hour interview, no problem at all. So I don't know if that's per camera. I wonder if some cameras have the problem more than others. I have no idea if Sony's going to fix this in a future firmware update. But if the overheating is just killing you, check out some faster cards and see if that helps. Also, there's a bunch of other tricks in my guide that we talk about that'll help a lot. And the great thing is when you compound all those little tips, you can get some amazing record times on this camera. Now again, I haven't had a lot of issues. The only time I've had issues is on a hot day outside in the sun when there's heat and sunlight hitting the camera, which is black, and it's just soaking up that heat and having a lot of issues. But if you're going to be shooting indoors, doing interviews, stage sets, you're probably not going to have too many issues, or at least I haven't had any issues. So obviously that's a big one, overheating for a lot of people. The next big one is rolling shutter. Now this one, again, I haven't seen a big problem with it. It is bad, don't get me wrong. And when you compare it to other cameras, it's really bad. But for me, it's almost like, comparing cars' top speeds. This one can go up to 180, this one's 130. None of that really matters unless you're on a track. For the rest of us just driving around, we don't need to, pay attention to our car's top speed. So on this camera, I don't do a lot of fast-paced whipping the camera around, and if you're going to be doing that or you do that a lot, this isn't the camera for you. Also, I don't shoot a lot of traffic, so I don't shoot a lot of buses, trains, cars. Most of what I do is B-roll, interviews, things like that, videos like this. So I'm not moving at 60 miles an hour and I'm not shaking the camera around. So given that, I haven't really seen any issues with rolling shutter. So that's going to depend on what you shoot. Also on what kind of lenses you use. If you do wildlife photography of cheetahs and you're using a 300mm lens and you're panning real fast and moving and filming fast objects, yeah, don't buy this camera. That would be a terrible idea. Much less when you're in Africa, it's going to overheat in 5 minutes. So it's a problem if you push it. I haven't had the issue, so just take that into consideration when you're thinking about this camera for whatever kind of productions you work on. Another massive con is no headphone jack on this camera. So this camera is pretty much useless for audio. There are some ways to get a headphone jack on this camera or to use other tools. I talk about that in the guide. There's several different options there. But if you're a serious documentary shooter, I wouldn't use this for interviews. You just can't trust it without an external recorder of some sort. Another problem is the battery life. And that's just the batteries. They suck. They're tiny. They don't have a lot of juice. So, there's other ways to deal with that. Use external power, USB batteries plugged into the side of the camera, things like that. So it can be worked around. Obviously, you may have noticed this huge box on the bottom of the camera. This is from my guide. I built this and showed you guys how to make it. It's called the Pro Box, and amongst XLR and other features, it uses Sony MPF batteries. So this is a medium-sized battery. You can get bigger ones or smaller ones, and I just have a plate on the back of the camera. So having a setup like this, I can shoot all day now, and it also helps with heat because the battery is external. So that's an option to think about instead of having the battery internally. The other nice thing is I don't have to get underneath the camera and open the little door to get the battery out. It's just like a C100. I can just pop the battery on and off from the back without having to deal with that at all. That brings us to another thing I really don't like, and it might seem small, but if you think about it, it sucks big time. And that is the freaking card insert area on this camera. To get the card in and out, you have to open the battery door, and it's in the most ridiculous place. I don't think I have massive hands or fingers or nubby fingers, but it is such a pain in the ass to get that card out of the camera. It's nestled even further away and harder to get to than the battery. Obviously, you can use the USB cable to import footage from your cards, but if you're gonna be shooting all day and swapping cameras in and out, it's gonna suck a lot to get the camera card out of there. So, I'm sure it's an engineering thing. There's just no room to put it on the side of the camera, but I really wish they would do that. I hate when they have card access on the bottom of the camera. It might seem like something small, but when you get out in the field and start shooting, little things like that start to really wear on you. So now let's talk about who this camera is for, who this camera is not for, should you buy it. So again, when considering if this camera is right for you, you should, without thinking about any camera, put down what's important to you. If you want an all-in-one system that does audio really well, then maybe you shouldn't be thinking about this camera. So for me, 4K is now a big thing. Battery life is close, so I've solved that with this. High frame rate isn't huge for me. It's nice, but I don't shoot every day at 120 frames or 96 frames per second. Image quality is big for me. Low light is nice, but again, a lot of the stuff I work with is lit, so I'm okay with something like a GH4 because I'm gonna light my interviews and the sets that I work on. Lens options is a big thing for me, so this camera passes there. So just put together that list and that'll give you a better idea as to what camera you should be thinking about. A GH4, this camera, other options from Sony, Canon, C100s, all that good stuff. In conclusion, I really like this camera. I like it in that you can strip it down to nothing and you're doing great on all fronts almost, except for maybe overheating if you're outside, and audio. And then for a very minimal setup and minimal cost, you can get audio up and running, put it on some sticks, and you're good to go. So I think this is one of the best cameras right now. I think it's great if you're on a budget. If you only have $1,000, $1,500 to spend, just be prepared. You can't shoot audio on this, or I wouldn't recommend audio on this without a recorder. Don't shoot out in the desert because it's gonna overheat. And be prepared to fork out more for your cards. That might help that issue, thanks to Erik Naso. And of course, rolling shutter. If you're gonna be shooting on long lenses or moving the camera a lot or shooting something that moves a lot, not going to be a good option. So that does it for this review. If you want to learn more, I have a couple videos coming up talking about this setup right here, how to build a small rig on the cheap, and a couple other a6300 related videos. Also check out my a6300 guide where we dive into all things getting this camera pimped out and ready to shoot video on a budget. We'll talk about lenses, audio, building little boxes that deal with power and audio, power options, and a whole section on some tips with overheating, as well as how to get correct exposure on this. So I hope that answered some questions you might be having about the a6300. Drop a comment if you have a question. I'd be more than happy to help you out. Subscribe for more videos here at DSLR Video Shooter. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.